Hello again. I'm finally home. The last time I was here was in 1984. Back then, I was happy as a boy because I brought to my house a device that gave me a whole 12 kilowatts of electricity. This device was kindly assembled for me by respected Paul Bowman. At the time, I thought it was just a miracle and the pinnacle of all scientific achievements because I had as much as 12 kilowatts of electricity at home. I couldn't even dream of such a thing. But nowadays, the progress has gone even further. So now I'm home again. And this time, thanks to Elon Musk, I brought home Starlink. Now, thanks to it as well as to the power device, which is still working without fail, I can be aware of all world events, and moreover, even communicate with you. We are now living in an amazing time when we have huge prospects and opportunities. I will be very sorry if it ends. But what can I expect from people? People remain people. I look at things sensibly, and I see that in view of what is now happening in the world, the chance of all of us is 90 to 10. 90% is that this humanity will come to an end, and 10% is that people will have enough wits to realize the threat of the climate situation, eventually come to unity and save the planet. However, in my opinion, the death of humanity is inevitable, and since this world is doomed anyway, I think it would be wrong to let humanity perish without knowing the truth. People must be purified of their sins before death. Being deluded, you swear at God, saying, "Why are you punishing us? We're so good. Why are you exterminating everyone?" I'll tell you why and who you are in reality. Many of you saw and knew what I'm going to tell you, but decided not to pay attention to it because it sort of didn't concern you, while in fact it concerned and still concerns each of you. Everyone who knew and kept silent, everyone who covered up this atrocity for the sake of their own authority and profit. The time has come for you to learn the truth about the greatest fall of humankind. It is time to find it out, become aware, and die. This is your catharsis, the catharsis of entire humanity. In the Quran, in Surah the Cattle, Ayah 131, it is said that Allah would not destroy towns unjustly, while their people were negligent. So today I'm fulfilling the will of Allah by telling you why you will be a Rasid. All of you are cannibals. Your religions have made you such. Every one of you who went to a church, a mosque, a synagogue, or a Datsun, no matter where. Everyone who drank wine there, ate bread, and inhaled the smell of incenses. Even your babies whom you took along with you to temples to commune them with the alleged divine grace. At that time, all of you consumed the flesh and blood of children who had died a painful death. Do you know where your religion actually originated from? In fact, the prophets did not build temples and did not invent rituals. Then how was it all maintained everywhere, on every continent? If you believe that religions originated from the dementia of primitive people who heard thunder, got scared and hence started praying, or who needed rain, and so they began to dance with a tambourine, or in order to go hunting and kill some chicken, they began to make sacrifices, and thus religion and faith in God emerged. If you think so, it means you are very stupid people. I'll tell you what happened in reality, and you can do whatever you want with this knowledge. So let's begin. 25,000 years ago, A highly developed biological form of life ruled here on this planet. And all humankind were slaves to soulless creatures, the Apexians. They were 1,000 times superior to the human race in both intellectual and technological development. They used people as labor force or as cattle to eat them, and for the slaves not to resist and to meekly do whatever they were ordered. The Apexians brought here what they had been successfully using on other planets, in other galaxies, for millions of years. It was exactly the Apexians who established the first religion on Earth. And they were actually the first gods worshipped by all humankind here. They used religion as the most effective tool for ruling, suppressing, and controlling the masses. And the first domed temples were erected 25,000 years ago. To this day, you keep building and attending them to pay tribute to the Apexians. It was precisely the Apexians who created the caste of priests. They selected among you the most cunning, the meanest, and the most loyal to them. Those were people who, for the sake of their own greatness, were ready to betray the entire humanity. It was the Apexians who elevated those scoundrels above you and made them intermediaries between themselves as gods and you as slaves. While for you this sounds like fictional news, for your high clergy, it is merely their history, which they kept a deep secret from you. That's exactly why they have retained such a deep reverence for the Apexians. And to this day, they've been waiting for the return of their masters, who gave them enormous power over people, as well as manipulation tools that perfectly work nowadays, just as they worked 25,000 years ago. The Apexians taught their priests what they loved so much themselves, and what kept their slaves in a death grip to such an extent that people really worshipped them as gods, worked for them like slaves, and voluntarily gave themselves to them for food. This is the secret which this superior race revealed to its priests. It's a secret of authority. It's not magic or rituals as some of you believe. Everything is much more practical and much tougher. The Apexians taught their priests how to prepare substances from parts of children's bodies, the substances that brought parishioners into a state of religious ecstasy. It is a sort of drug of biological origin. By using it, the priests could create a powerful psychological attachment of a person to their religion, basically to create a slave for themselves. For preparing this drug, they used blood, bones, and brain fragments of the youngest representatives of the human race. Infants and children under 6 years old were the most valued. I'll explain to you what role the age played and why. At the age of 6, children undergo metamorphoses. Such metamorphoses occur in humans in the process of their development only twice in their lives. The first time at about 6 years old, and the second time between 12 to 14 years. With each subsequent metamorphosis, the value of a child for preparing those special substances diminishes. Before a child reaches the age of 6, he is considered to be the most valuable, because until this age, he has the power that can be used to conquer the masses. Later on, as soon as a child turns 6, and up to 14 years old, his power becomes considerably smaller. Whereas after the age of 14, a human has no value at all. He becomes just a slave, one of the sources of power for his masters, as long as he is alive, or just food, but nothing more. He loses the value he had as a child. This is how children's ritual sacrifices and what is now called adrenochrome appeared. Many of you heard about adrenochrome, and you think you understand what it is. You don't understand anything. You only know what you are allowed to know. Adrenochrome is considered to be a drug or a kind of an elixir of youth for the elite and members of the ninth circle of Satan order. But that's far from being all. The complete set introduced into religions had three components. These are substances made of blood, bones, and fragments of a child's brain. And an essential condition for the creation of these drugs was a protracted and painful death of the victim. The scarier, longer, and more painfully a child was dying, the stronger and more effective the drug turned out to be. Perhaps I will tell you what was done and for what purpose. Don't be afraid. There will be no instructions. I will only tell you as much as you should know, for realizing the price someone pays for the minutes of your bliss in temples. Before killing a victim, a priest tortures them for a long time and in various sophisticated ways. At the same time, he makes sure that they are constantly at the peak of pain, suffering, and fear. I won't tell you in detail how priests tortured and tormented children to get the long-awaited substance. You can find this in other sources as well. The very fact that they forced children to suffer very long and painfully and be fully aware of the inevitability of their death was the key point in those tortures. This was done to ensure that a child's body would begin to secrete certain hormones, the ones which the priests needed to brew their potion. In response to severe pain, suffering, and torment, compensatory mechanisms are triggered in the body. At this moment, a child's body is struggling to defend itself with all its might in order to save its life. The brain begins to produce a huge amount of hormones, and certain chemical processes are activated in the body. And at the time when the blood is heavily saturated with these substances, the priest had to kill the victim in a special way. After that, the blood was drained, and certain parts of the brain and bones were taken away. In particular, the occipital bone of the skull and the pubic bone of the pelvis, although the entire skull and all pelvic bones were often taken away too. What did the priest do with this stuff afterwards? They mixed the blood of a tortured and killed victim into drinks, which they used in rituals, such as your so-called Holy Communion nowadays, sometimes in small doses, sometimes in concentrated forms. They drank those drinks themselves and gave them to the flock, and it was enough to drink just a small amount of this mixture to get the desired effect. This is the case when minimal doses produce a great result. This substance acts like homeopathy. Getting into your body, it triggers a response, activates your hormonal system, and forces it to work the way the priests want. Hence, there are the effects you experience in your temples, starting from inner peace, lightness, and elation, up to euphoria and incredible inner ecstasy. If you think that it was necessary to consume only a liquid potion, you are mistaken. The extracted bones of a tortured and killed child were ground into powder, mixed with flour, and various products were baked from this mixture, including bread, such as communion or altar bread nowadays. The priests gave all this stuff to eat and drink to the adherents of their cults, or parishioners, if we call it in modern terms. However, what they extracted from the brain of a tortured and killed child was much more powerful. As early as 25,000 years ago, the Apexians taught their priests to extract essential compounds from specific parts of a child's brain and mix them with various incense. The obtained essence itself has no smell, so it can be easily and imperceptibly mixed into absolutely any aromatic product. And it's enough to just inhale air once for these substances to get directly into your brain, forcing it to work in a particular way. Look what a coincidence. The oldest form of sacrifice to deities is burning incense. Open the Bible, and you will see that Yahweh personally told Abraham, the ancestor of all Jews and Arab tribes, how to properly perform the ritual of worshipping him, including by burning incense. 6,000 years ago, this practice appeared among the Sumerians, and later, it allegedly accidentally penetrated into all existing religions of the world. This is such a subtle, inconspicuous, and even pleasant element that very few people pay attention to. Each of you now has this fragrance surfaced in your memory, not just any fragrance, but that very specific one. You cannot confuse it with anything. Rummage in your memory storerooms, and you will definitely recall this particular smell of labdanum or bakur, with the addition of a light note of dead flesh. In their time, the Apexians divided religions and established various cults, similar to those existing to this day. In some temples, people inhaled, drank, and ate those products at the same time. In other temples, they just inhaled or drank or ate them. But in all cults, it worked in the same way. It was especially powerful where all three components were combined together, where a person was given something to drink and to eat, and where he inhaled these incense. Doesn't this remind you of anything? As soon as just a small amount of these substances enter a person's body, he begins to experience incredible blissful states up to religious ecstasy. And haven't you seen such blissful people in your temples? Or haven't you experienced this yourselves? Recall. Each of you felt this to a greater or lesser extent when you came to an old famous temple or mosque for a big holiday and suddenly had an allegedly sublime spiritual state, a feeling of lightness and freedom, when as if a load was removed from your heart and you felt all your sins falling off you right away. You felt how contact with the divine was purifying you, and then you were already clean and renewed before the Lord. You looked around, saw the same blissful faces as yours, and it seemed to you that from that moment on, you would love everyone and everything. And then, there was more. At some point, such euphoria overwhelmed you, as if the divine hand itself touched you with its presence. And it seemed to you that it was true grace descending onto this place and pouring out onto all believers. However, the truth is that by means of those substances, a tremendous inner illusion is created in a person that he is in real contact with the divine. If, when coming to a temple, a person experiences a state of such deep religious ecstasy at least once, he will never forget it. And the main thing is that the experienced states remove any doubts about the existence of God. Moreover, whether a person wants to or not, he begins to perceive a priest as a true mediator between him and God. Because, thanks to the priest, the person has come into contact with this divine revelation and got rid of the sins that torment him. Thus, a person comes out of the temple, being so pure and light inside, he is literally about to fly up. And this state is preserved in many people for quite a long time, depending on the amount of adrenochrome that entered their bodies. Yet, a few days pass, a person's hormonal system calms down and returns to its natural mode of operation, and the whole burden of his earthly existence falls onto the person like a pile of stones. He feels that he has betrayed God because he got distracted by earthly things and lost grace. He feels that he is sinful again, and that he's not even any better than Judas, who betrayed his Lord. So he again wants to return to the same temple and to the same priest in order to get purified and come into contact with divine grace. Again, that's already a physical need. That's how parishioners' dependence on religion emerges, and that's how the power of priests over people is maintained. However, not every day, and not in every temple, a person is able to get such an effect. And it is easy to distinguish successful temples, where the flow of believers never stops, from those that become forgotten. Each of you knows these temples. When great holidays and big events take place, when relics of alleged saints, ancient so-called sacred items or icons are brought to temples, when crowds of hopeful people run to a dead piece of meat or to some shrine to beg something for themselves, then getting on these very days into these particular temples, people suddenly begin to experience extraordinary inspiration from contact with the divine. And they are sure it became possible only thanks to those relics, or that icon, or thanks to the priests and their tireless work for the benefit of people, when in order to absolve you of sins and purify you with their prayers and their service, they attain God's forgiveness for you, and God responds to their prayers and absolves you of your sins. So you feel that right at the moment God has really cleansed you. While in reality, everything is banal, simple, and very tough as usual. All your religious ecstasy is just an effect of a chemical cocktail, made of a huge concentrated amount of hormones, produced by the body of a child, whom priests have tortured and killed. And the state that a believer experiences is the exact opposite of the state that the child experienced when being tortured by the priests. The amazing thing is that at those moments, none of you pondered. What have you actually done to deserve the touch of God and His grace? Saints devoted years of their lives to attaining at least a slight contact with this state, trying to earn it through hard inner work. Wow, how stupid the saints were. They didn't know that grace was distributed in temples on schedule. I may be accused of devaluing and denying the existence of any spiritual experience. After all, there are also true states when a person seems to feel the same. Of course, there is true experience, but you cannot confuse it with anything else. This is what resonates inside you, in the depths. However, if a person lives by the mind, he perceives everything around him only through his mind. then it's a huge problem for him to distinguish where there is merely a hormonal euphoria from eating the flesh and blood of tortured babies, and where there are true spiritual states. Open your eyes. Everything in your temples has always been built on lies and manipulation. Lighting, a special disposition of people, the monotonous recitative of a priest, special music or choir, synchronously performed actions, and a special sequence of services and rituals. All this is used to prepare, synchronize, and attune the crowd to the acceptance of the so-called divine grace. And it wasn't by chance that the rule was introduced to take communion solely on an empty stomach, so as not to reduce the effect of adrenochrome, and make sure that not a single drop of wine would be spilled, and not a single crumb of bread would fall to the floor, so as not to leave evidence anywhere. Moreover, church bottles and bags must not be just thrown away. It is better to burn them, so that no one would accidentally find traces of what the priests don't want them to find. In fact, it is quite a cynical approach when they charge believers with the duty of destroying traces of their crime. In the meantime, the longer a collective ritual or prayer lasts, the more substances from the body of a tormented and killed child gets into your body, and the longer and deeper your religious ecstasy is. You yourselves have repeatedly observed this in your temples, when normal, sensible people turned into fanatical madmen by the end of religious service. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, everyone comes to a temple in their everyday state. Everyone thinks about something of their own, about their problems. But as soon as a ritual begins, the priest starts mumbling, and smells are emitted. The crowd's mood gradually begins to change. When the communion takes place, literally after 5 minutes, the crowd starts getting fanatical. Someone falls to their knees and starts beating their head against the floor. Someone else goes off into hysteria in front of the icons, praying and sobbing. An old lady who was just recently trembling and barely crawling into the temple on crutches suddenly feels as if all her diseases are leaving her. Now she's no longer burdened by her sins. Nothing hurts in her body anymore. She walks freely and emits fragrance, carrying crutches under her arm, with a blissful smile on her lips. Meanwhile, someone else feels that he is gaining holiness right now. Icons are coming to life for him. The saints descend from the images, and he feels that God is 100% present in this temple here and now. In other words, there is complete madness and hysteria, although just an hour ago, those were quite sane and normal people, like everyone else. In reality, at this very moment, an enormous inner illusion is being created inside them. They are sure that they are actually in contact with the divine, because nowhere else in their everyday life and under no circumstances have they ever experienced anything like that, and will not be able to experience it. Therefore, having experienced these states once, people rush back to their temples to partake of this divine ecstasy again. This zombifies them and creates an illusion of convergence with God. This is how totally devoted religious fanatics are created. And how can you later convince such a person that all this is a deception, a very cruel deception? In no way. Will such a person refuse the opportunity to experience it again? Of course not. And if a person experiences such states with a certain periodicity, you can consider him a permanent sponsor, emotional, financial, and electoral, at the same time. Such a person simply becomes a slave to the priests. In fact, haven't you felt, while being in a temple, that something is wrong with you there? How your consciousness narrows, how you get lost, how your thoughts unpredictably jump in various directions. Then they calm down, and then bliss appears. You begin to see icons coming to life or shadows going away. and you feel the presence of God right next to you. You feel freedom. You feel life inside you. While in reality, you feel how someone's life, taken away by the priests, is turning you into slaves. The truth is that when you take communion, you drink the blood of tortured children. When you eat ritual bread, you eat the flesh of children who were tortured to death. And when you inhale the fragrant air of your temples, you breathe the essence made of the brain of a tortured child who died a horrible death. Just a couple of instants of your divine ecstasy, which you experienced in temples, cost someone's child a whole life. Do you really want to say that you're now hearing this information for the first time in your life? Or maybe you haven't seen it in history. Don't lie. Don't lie to yourselves. You saw and knew everything. But you believed that the fate of those children didn't concern you. Proudlings and hypocrites. Even what I am now saying hurts you, just because you've learned that you are accomplices in this crime. And you've suddenly realized the horror of your situation. There is no way for you to justify yourselves. You have nothing to make amends for your guilt, and in no way can you avoid a fair retribution. It is precisely the exposure and the fear of inevitable punishment that is terrifying you now, but not the deaths of millions of children. Did you not know it? Have you been deceived? Was this happening without your knowledge? But recall why you went to those temples. Were you looking for God there? No. Only a few were looking for God. And those who were really looking for Him have found Him without any temples. While you went there to solve your material problems, to rise above others, and to experience this divine ecstasy. The truth is that both for you and for your priests, the main thing was well-fed stomachs, dressed bodies, and brass tinkling in your pockets. But you didn't care about others. Do you, the devourers of your own children, really think that your sin is lesser than the sin of those who gave you children as food? What I'm now saying is a black mark on each and every one of you. On all those who knew, on everyone who suspected and was silent, and on everyone who didn't care. This crime began 25,000 years ago, and it continues to this day. Both at that time and nowadays, priests who possessed the recipes of these potions gained unlimited power over people. They will never give it up. And this is proved by many millennia of history of more than one human civilization. In his time, El didn't disdain to use the legacy of the Apexians either. He established a new religion by replacing the Apexians with new gods, himself and his children. And to this day, their names have been on your lips. But unlike people who were negligent about the truth and easily lost it, those who were behind religions quite scrupulously kept, and still keep, every letter of the ancient tradition brought to the earth 25,000 years ago by the Apexians. Even when El and his Elysium had been erased, this knowledge didn't disappear anywhere. It was taken underground to Agartha by El's followers. For 6 millennia, peace and order reigned on earth until favorable conditions were created for the resumption of this knowledge. 6,000 years ago, the keepers of this knowledge managed to come out of Agartha to the surface and went to people. The first whom they gave this knowledge to were Sumerians. That is when kings, priests, and military leaders emerged. And that's when religion and construction of domed temples started over again. Back then, human sacrifices were reintroduced, along with adrenochrome, and at the same time, a huge number of burials with children's remains appeared. As soon as religions were established again, from that moment till nowadays, the more temples were erected, the more children disappeared without a trace. Since then, and to this day, behind all religions, there have been the keepers, or as they are also called, the architectons of this world. They've been carefully making sure that the main and the most terrible secret of all religions remains a secret. And they've been doing it quite well up to this moment. Yes, this information may be shocking to many people, and many will say, "What is he talking about?" But I will answer the following. I'm telling the truth and the verity about what existed and still exists, although soon it won't exist anymore, at least on this planet. Everything I'm saying, every word of mine is confirmed by irrefutable evidence that you, as humanity, have accumulated in sufficient amounts to pass a sentence on yourselves. I will set aside myths and legends and focus only on specific facts that your history is full of, the facts which cannot be explained metaphorically, philosophically, or in some ambiguous way. These are the bodies of children, the burials of their remains at the sites of ritual sacrifices. How many of your children were burnt in fire, allegedly, as a sacrifice to the god Moloch or Baal? That was a very common practice among all the Chaldean tribes. Passing through fire. That's what they called it in the Torah. Everyone has heard it, and you all know this story from ancient images. When a baby was placed in the hands of a huge statue of a horned deity from where it rolled into the fire. After such burnings, children's ashes and remains were placed in special vessels and buried in the ground on so-called tophets. Those were entire fields of burial urns with the ashes of murdered children. You definitely know at least one site of this kind from the Bible. It's the Valley of Hinnom, which later became a prototype of the fiery hell. The largest of the discovered fields of this kind was in Carthage, where the remains of about 20,000 children were unearthed, and most of them were infants up to 6 months old. Can you imagine the scale? This is just one region, and this is only what was found. 20,000 burnt children. Do you really believe that someone would just throw away such a huge amount of the most valuable substance? After all, to burn is the same as to throw away. No, they weren't just burnt. You must know that there was no other purpose of what is called the ritual sacrifice of children except obtaining blood and parts of their bodies, so that priests could later brew their potions from them. They didn't cause any rain through that burning, and didn't appease gods with innocent souls. And the sun wouldn't stop shining, and the world wouldn't collapse if they stopped doing that. Those who tried to make sacrifices for such a purpose were merely imitators who didn't know the essence. Those are isolated cases, and they are easy to distinguish from the rest. As for all the legends that gods supposedly demand sacrifices for themselves, it was just a justification for the flock, a means to justify this bloodbates, and even to convince people that it was necessary. Do you think it is primitive to believe in such explanations? Yet, you were somehow convinced of the need to drink the blood and eat the flesh of Christ, whom you crucified. You do believe in that. And in the same way, ancient people believed. As a matter of fact, It wasn't abstract gods who needed those sacrifices, but specific priests and those who were behind them. And there is no mysticism or magic there. There is just a practical and very rigid calculation. Therefore, burning bodies was merely one of the ways to destroy the traces of what they did to those children. And if you look at the other remains that weren't burnt, but simply buried, you will see exactly what I'm telling you about. In different parts of the earth, on different continents, among the tribes of Mesoamerica, among Celtic Druids, on the shores of the Sea of Azov, on Mount Lycaon in Greece, in India, in Myanmar, and in other places, archaeologists find a huge number of children's bodies killed in a very similar way. These are often dismembered bodies, with legs cut off at the joints and severed heads, which was obviously done with surgical precision, indicating a great practice of the priest who did it. If skulls remained at the crime scene, if they were not taken away completely, they usually lack specific bones. The same applies to skeletons, where some fragments are missing. And next to relatively whole skeletons, there is often a large number of separate bones scattered all around. Not so long ago, a similar burial site has been found in Peru, where, in addition to about 140 children's bodies, individual bones are present in such numbers that it's not even possible to restore skeletons from them in order to calculate the number of children they were taken from. After performing DNA tests of the remains, researchers discovered that those children had been brought to one site for ritual sacrifice from all over the country. Doesn't this remind you of the reality of today, when children quietly disappear across a country one by one, and nobody knows where all of them end up together? Also, a recurring detail of ritual murders were splits and traces of cuts on the bones, which indicates that soft tissues were removed from them. And if they actually tried to burn bodies after killing them, but burnt bones remained thereafter, you can even see that the bodies had been previously drained of blood. The thing is that if there was no blood in adjacent tissues during burning, the bone would be white after heat treatment. Such remains are also found. You can find a lot of similar examples. And everywhere, there will be the same signs that blood was drained from children's bodies, specific bones were removed, and parts of their skulls or entire heads were taken away. It looks like the same maniac was operating all over the world. Although, in fact, this is really so. There is one more detail that your scientists still fail to explain. At some burial sites, children were laid out according to their age, in ascending order, one or several children in every age group. I mean, babies, children from 6 years old, and teenagers lay separately. It is clear that this isn't accidental. And again, there is no sacred meaning here. This is sorting. This was done so as not to mix and not to confuse the drugs. Which one would work stronger and which one would be weaker? There is an analogy with present-day reality, right? In the same way, manufacturers of narcotic substances pack their products according to their quality and effects. See how everything is easily and simply explained, if you do not look for a deep sacred meaning where there is none. You persistently didn't even see what was nearly on the surface in front of you. When the remains of children's bodies were found, right next to bread-baking ovens, or at the sites of old wineries, you also tried to find some magical or ritual explanation to that. And no one ever wondered, what do children's corpses do in places where bread and wine were made? I will answer you. Those were the sites for production of adrenochrome and bone meal. Victims were killed right on the spot. Bones and blood were added to flour and wine, packaged and shipped from those sites, to where there was a demand. Many similar burials were found in the territory of the Crimean Azov region, where children were allegedly sacrificed until the Middle Ages, meaning at the same time and right next to the Orthodox Byzantine Empire. Historians are still puzzled over what kind of nation did it all there. While that wasn't a nation, those were manufacturers and suppliers of magic potions for temples of various cults. You also try to attribute some mystical meaning to the items found at burial sites. But it's amazing what you can see if you look at things more simply, just as they are. What is usually found next to body remains? Knives, some basins and jugs, and children's bones are often found mixed with fragments of amphoras. Moreover, millstones and incense burners are found nearby. I think the purpose of those items becomes clear now. Historians rack their brains about what could be the purpose of millstones during a ritual sacrifice. Have you got it now? Millstones or grain grinders were used to make bone meal right on the spot. Is it disgusting to listen? It is, when you understand what is behind each of those items. And do you want to say you didn't know about child sacrifices? You knew, but you didn't care. Yesterday, this was a remote antiquity for you. And the fate of those children didn't evoke any pity or compassion in you. Just look at how quickly ancient rituals, which didn't concern you in any way, have suddenly turned into a completely tangible and cruel picture of your reality. And the inexplicable dark spots in history have suddenly become crystal clear and understandable. You simply shouldn't have been looking for mysticism where brutal murders were committed. After all, murder doesn't cease to be such just because of the statute of limitations. Everything has always been on the surface. You just looked and didn't see, or you didn't want to see it. You were openly shown and told the truth in ancient texts and artifacts, as well as on very old bas-reliefs and petroglyphs that can be read like an open book. But do you have enough wits to see what was embedded in ancient legends and simple drawings, and to compare it with the reality of today? Perhaps I'll give you a hint on how to see and where to look. In ancient texts, in order to covertly hint at the use of children in their rituals, instead of the word child, such words as chick, sprout, or young sprout, offshoot, or lamb were used, for example. This way, they also classified victims by their age and gender. And does this practice actually differ from the present-day use by child traffickers on the dark net of such terms as bunnies and others to denote their commodities? Do you think people were not so smart in ancient times? However, in addition to words, there were also symbolic images. For instance, there was a symbol associated with the burnt offering ritual, since the urn where the remains of children were buried had the shape of a vessel. A vessel became a hidden or metaphorical symbol of child sacrifice. Sometimes it was depicted with human features, and sometimes just as an ordinary jug or amphora. And depending on the general context of a picture, the contents of the jug differed. It denoted either the remains of bodies, meaning an already performed ritual, or prepared wine with blood, in other words, adrenochrome. While the second popular hidden symbol of child sacrifices was grain, as a hint at the bread baked with the inclusion of children's bones. Do you want to say you haven't seen those images? An amphora with grain stalks, a jug, and a sheaf of wheat, wine and bread, are known as the symbols of prosperity and fertility, while in fact they denote the blood and flesh of tortured and murdered children. The so-called Holy Communion of yours is also an ancient ritual that Christians simply appropriated for themselves and introduced a monopoly on it, but in reality, they have forced millions of people to eat their own children. If earlier it was practiced in separate places, among individual peoples and small cults, with the advent of Christianity, this horrible ritual spread to half of the world. Eating the flesh and blood of a sacrificed god is an ancient ritual of theophagy. It was introduced in this civilization 6,000 years ago. At the same time, there appeared a myth of the creation of this world and humans from flesh and blood of a dismembered deity. When his veins became rivers, his hands turned into mountains, parasites on his body turned into humans, and so on and so forth. This seems to be a naive fairy tale, but with such fairy tales, a key mindset was ingrained into people's consciousness, that human life and the existence of the world completely depend on a bloody sacrifice, because once God sacrificed himself for the sake of people. A familiar idea, isn't it? Your priests have been carrying it from cult to cult, from religion to religion, for millennia. There is actually no need to invent anything new, if the old idea works quite well. This way they justified the need for human sacrifice. It turns out that gods demand sacrifices because they have the right to do so, as they themselves once sacrificed their flesh and blood for humans. So now, in order to join God, one should just consume the flesh and blood of his creations, preferably the youngest children. Why did parents often sacrifice their children voluntarily? It was even considered an honor if your child was selected for this purpose. In Phoenicia, when a sacrificial offering was performed, even representatives of aristocracy gave away their dearest child. And it was considered to be especially valuable if it was the only child in the family. Judeans sacrificed their firstborns. It would seem, where is the logic? While the logic here is simple. When parents were eating their own children and started feeling incredible bliss, they were sure that God really responded to their sacrifice and honored them with his presence. That's why they gave away their biggest treasure so easily, and they were sure their children were going to God. The murder of infants was often justified by the fact that they allegedly have no soul. Well, it is easy to talk about the absence of something that you yourself don't have. There were cults where ritual murders followed by eating children's flesh and blood were performed openly. But that couldn't last long. So the priests understood that they wouldn't be able to spread it to large masses in this form. Although in some narrow circles, it is practiced to this day. While for ordinary people, they introduced a replacement with a supposedly symbolic eating of flour products or cereals and consumption of some drink, often intoxicating, with such mandatory additives as blood and bone meal of tortured children. For example, some tribes of Mesoamerica first offered real human sacrifices, ate real flesh and drank real blood, but later on they replaced it with eating a deity figurine made of corn or amaranth flour with the addition of adrenochrome. This god made of dough was dismembered and shared among all members of the tribe, and then they all together had to breed with fragments of their children, cried and danced at a common ritual feast. There are preserved testimonies of conquistadors who witnessed it all when they came there. In India, in Brahmanism, human sacrifices were replaced with rice cakes, where adrenochrome was added. Moreover, it was believed that by his magical ritual actions, A Brahmin allegedly turned those cakes into real flesh. Later on, it was all transformed into the well-known current version of this ritual with bread and wine, which you call the Holy Communion. Long before it was introduced in Christianity, rituals with bread and wine had been a mandatory element of Dionysian bacchanalias, Greek symposia, and even meetings of Pythagoreans. Communion was also present in the European cult of the god Mithras. Some Christian preachers were outraged at that, because they couldn't explain why pagans had this ritual for a long time, if Christ allegedly commanded to perform it only recently. Although before that, wine and unleavened bread had already been a required element of the Passover ritual meal among Judeans. Ask them what they add to their holiday bread. So basically, there is nothing new under the moon. I have just shown you only little fragments of one big crime that remains unpunished for several millennia. Yet, there are still a lot of children who haven't been found or haven't been unearthed yet. And there are a great many who were burnt or ground with no trace of them left. And even none of the most intelligent and educated historians or anthropologists will answer you. Who needed those victims, and why? And most importantly, why were infants slaughtered in such numbers? How to explain this? By a god's bloodlust. These are fairy tales, in fact. Why were the people who performed sacrificial rituals so purposeful then? Did gods actually cancel crop failure for them in exchange? Or did neighboring tribes stop attacking them? Or did everyone live happily ever after thanks to those sacrifices? Of course not. But since it was done so actively and regularly, hence those who did it received what they wanted. So the question is, what was it? And everything is simple. For priests it meant authority, whereas for the flock it was an illusion. It was such an illusion that they were ready to watch their children being tortured, slaughtered, and burnt alive, while they themselves were crying and dancing at a common ritual event. However, they were crying not because they saw their children dying. They were crying of incredible delight that seized them from contact with the divine, because by that moment, they had already eaten and inhaled the remains of other children. So at that moment, they felt an unbelievable divine ecstasy. That's the kind of authority it gave and keeps giving to the priests. But why should I tell you all of this? Why didn't you want to figure it out yourselves over this entire time? You found dismembered corpses of children, and nobody even thought of investigating those murders. You only had enough wits to turn this into a sacred action, a ritual of worshipping gods. But you haven't done anything to find the culprits and to stop it. After all, there is nothing complicated or incomprehensible in what I have told you. And, in my opinion, you had plenty of time to add 2 plus 2 and to compare it all on your own. Perhaps the murderers of your children would have been exposed much earlier, and your children would have stopped disappearing. Some of you are now thinking, what a good fellow he is. He opened our eyes to such a terrible secret. But you fail to understand one thing. The fact that it is me who is telling you this is a sentence for you. It's a black mark on each and every one who has done nothing to stop this evil. Everything was actually done in your sight. There were numerous cases in history when those criminals themselves were caught red-handed, and their guilt was confirmed by a lot of evidence. Jews were especially prominent in that. For a long time, almost until the 20th century, Some groups of Jews were accused of the fact that their sacred books instructed them to torture Gentile children and use their blood for Jewish rituals. First accusations of this kind emerged in the first centuries of the Christian era, but the matter received wide publicity only in the 12th century. Since then, criminal cases of ritual murders were initiated across the world, in the USA, in Egypt, in the Russian Empire, and almost all over Europe. Gradually, the accusations were supplemented with new details. For example, it was said that Jews crucified Christian children by repeating the crucifixion of Christ. Thus, they committed an act of mockery of the Christian faith. In other places, when witnesses were interrogated, they said that Jews had a special barrel. They placed a child in that barrel and rolled it until as many hematomas as possible were formed on his body. This was done so that the maximum amount of blood would reach the upper layers of his skin. Then the victim was taken out of the barrel, and his skin was pierced with nails all over the body to drain more blood. They later used the blood obtained in this way during festive rituals, adding it to pastries, for example, to unleavened bread or matzo, and then their whole family ate it all, sometimes sharing it with their non-Jewish neighbors. Or they also took a piece of cloth, dipped it into blood, and when it dried, the cloth was burnt, while the ashes were added to food on religious feasts. Accusations of this kind didn't appear out of the blue. People really noticed that children started disappearing. Moreover, they began to find bodies that very much fit the descriptions of ritual murders committed by Jews. They found bloodless children's bodies with nail punctures on them. They also found bodies with very badly worn skin, as if it had been burnt. It seemed that somebody had rubbed it almost to the point of ignition. There were real cases when Jews were caught red-handed at the crime scene, when numerous evidence was found, and when it was impossible to deny their involvement in the crime. That is, corpus delicti and the grounds for accusations of this kind really existed. There were witnesses who testified against Jews. Those were usually people who worked for them and became accomplices in their crimes. Although sometimes there were false accusations when it turned out that Jews were actually not involved, or when a missing child suddenly returned home himself. These cases were later used as an argument that rumors about the bloodthirstiness of Jews were just a slander, a commonplace medieval myth. However, there were cases when Jews compromised themselves during interrogations, were inconsistent in their testimonies, and sometimes were caught at blunt lies. Final decisions on such cases were usually made not by a local court, but by courts of higher instances. And, paradoxically enough, when higher courts considered such cases, Jews were magically acquitted, whereas those who had denounced them and testified against them were exiled or executed. As for the cases when it was impossible to refute the guilt of Jews, and they were brought to justice, everything was later arranged in such a way as if they had committed the crime for personal reasons, or had just gone crazy. In other words, courts did their utmost to eliminate the version of ritual murder. Jews had a weighty argument against all the accusations. The Torah explicitly forbids Jews to consume blood. It does forbid it as food, but adrenochrome is not food, it is power. If we proceed from the position of the highest Jewish priests in the hierarchy of the powers that be, they have power over many nations. And if you look from such a perspective, in that very Torah, in that very Talmud, and in many other Judean religious books, you can find a sufficient number of instructions for Jews to dominate other nations in every possible way. Yet, if you carefully consider specific criminal cases that were initiated against Jews for ritual murders, you can find a strange coincidence. It turns out that very often, higher clergymen of Orthodox and Catholic Christianity, popes, Protestant pastors, czars, and kings actually defended them. Do you know why they did it? Because if one person is exposed, everyone will be exposed. Therefore, they always covered and defended each other. What was the ultimate end of the whole story of Jewish ritual murders of children? A high-profile case was conducted and promoted all over the world, as a result of which the Jews were explicitly acquitted, and it was declared, let's just end this entire libel story. All of you are civilized people, so stop believing in medieval legends. And it was legally prohibited even to accuse Jews of ritual murder. This is a classic style of the keepers. Since the first centuries AD to the present day, so many criminal cases have been initiated. A great many proofs and eyewitness testimonies have been collected. So many times Jews gave themselves away by giving inconsistent testimonies, and lots of bodies of tortured and murdered children have been found. But now, all this turns out to be just a slander, a blood libel against Jews. I understand that everything can be altered. Witnesses can be bribed or imprisoned. Evidence can be destroyed, and laws can be amended. Everything can be cleaned, and everything can be erased. What are you scums going to do with the bodies of dead children? How can you explain their presence if no one is to blame and no one killed them? If my memory serves me correctly, the last case of blood libel was opened in the 1970s in one of the republics of the Soviet Union. However, this doesn't mean that such crimes stopped happening. This only means that back then, it was still possible to talk about them. But later, this opportunity was eliminated too. Do you think this isn't happening now? Recently, I came across news about an unsolved murder of a group of children, which in many aspects coincides with what was happening in the times of the so-called blood libel. However, now it is even impossible to hint at the version of ritual murder, not to mention openly accusing anyone. Moreover, no one will investigate this version, and often those who told the truth, or at least tried to get to it, were accused of anti-Semitism and extremism and shut up. In the history of blood libel, you can find examples when not murderers were the ones to be exiled or executed, but witnesses who denounced them. The truth is that even your freedom of speech is controlled not by politicians or businessmen, as many of you believe, but by the priests and the keepers who are behind them. So do Jews actually want to say that they don't have any secret rituals? They should stop lying. They do have them. Much is written in their books directly, or between the lines. A lot of their texts haven't been translated yet, and some are even prohibited from being translated. And there are also ciphered texts, where the sequence of words and alternate vowels completely changes the meaning of a phrase. The truth is that if you're not a Jew, moreover not an ordinary Jew, but a representative of a special caste, you'll never know the essence of the entire ancient tradition preserved by the top priests of this nation. They enjoy manipulating the topic of persecution and genocide of their people to achieve their mercenary goals. But do you know what is really the biggest and most significant genocide in the world? I think, now you can already guess it, the most massive genocide in the history of mankind is the genocide of children, and it doesn't cease to this day. All religions are involved in it. External forms changed. New religions appeared. Older religions were altered. but their deceitful, manipulative essence and the use of adrenochrome always remained unchanged. Even if a cult is minor, but it has been created by the keepers, adrenochrome will definitely be used there. In those religions where there were no elements of communion, people inhaled this substance, so more emphasis was placed on aroma products and labdanum. Note how the culture of incense is developed in the East, for instance, in Arab countries or in India, where the cults of Vishnu and Krishna are present. This is quite obvious, but very few people think and wonder why. Why is it exactly incense that penetrates all religions? What do gods need fume for? Let's suppose in the past, people could believe in its magical properties. But why did it enter Islam and Christianity, where magic was strictly forbidden by the prophets? Let me show you something you haven't seen, and you haven't even looked in this direction. The prophets came and brought the truth, but as soon as they left this world, Shaitan's slaves immediately appeared, or it would be more correct to say, the messengers of the keepers. And they turned a new teaching introduced by a prophet into another religion, with the same manipulations and the same sacraments, meaning with adrenochrome. Eventually, they composed scriptures, although none of the prophets created them. But the scriptures later became sacred, supposedly given by God, although as a rule, they completely contradicted what the prophets had said. Yes, they included some words that really came from the prophets, and couldn't be excluded because many people knew them. But authors of the scriptures immediately gave plenty of explanations and interpretations from their mind, adding significance and importance to intermediaries appointed by the keepers. Thus, the teachings of the prophets were substituted and distorted beyond recognition. Yet, how did the keepers manage to do this? If people still had a fresh memory of the knowledge brought by the prophets, how did the keepers succeed to replace the alive truth with lies and manipulation? When the prophets were here, they didn't need power or authority for people to listen to them. They had God's love. People who were open towards God felt this love. They felt the truth, and that's why they followed the prophets. However, such people were able to create free movement, which would be very undesirable for the keepers. So when people started acting and uniting around a prophet's teaching, the keepers decided to use the old reliable method. If you cannot defeat someone, become their leader. Based on the teachings of the prophets, they built their usual form of control over people's consciousness, religions. And in order to retain authority, they included magic and feigned miracles into religions, which people themselves paid for with their power of faith. However, fairy tales, manipulation of human pridefulness, and fake miracles cannot be a solid foundation, because those who became the leaders in religions had nothing to give people, since they themselves were empty like a bucket without a bottom. They didn't have the main thing, love, that love which the prophets brought here. Those leaders had nothing to keep people in their organizations. Therefore, chemical methods of influencing the human hormonal structure were introduced into religions. And look, when the prophets were here, they held conversations with people mostly outside, in the open air, and rarely in somebody's houses. But they didn't build temples, didn't drive crowds of people into premises, and didn't act as main speakers or imams, as it is practiced nowadays. They simply talked to people as if they were friends and told them that there's the only temple of God, the one that a person can build inside oneself, that you shouldn't desire anything material and shouldn't ask God for anything but spiritual salvation. In other words, for anything other than God's love, because nothing can protect a person except God's love. Everything was simple. The prophets told people how to learn to love and use simple, clear words. And all the prophets said that there are no and there cannot be any intermediaries between a human and God. But what did those who came to distort their teachings do? First of all, they began to gather large crowds, drive people into temples, and include incense into rituals. In Christianity, the first to introduce that were Peter and Paul. Why did Paul's distorted teaching become so popular within a few years? And in a matter of years, numerous churches appeared, and ecumenical patriarchs and bishops emerged. It's all because the first thing Peter and Paul started doing was to use adrenochrome. They introduced it in churches, and at that time, masses of people began to feel light and God's power descending on them. Moreover, the two fellows used adrenochrome to bind people who were beneficial to them. They first gave them their potion to taste, not saying what it was, not saying that they were drinking the blood of murdered children. And when those people got steadily hooked on adrenochrome, they showed them where it was taken from. In such a way, emperors, kings, and other authority figures became their slaves. That's what Peter and Paul were doing. And that's why they gained authority and popularity so fast. Their initiated priests continue to do the same. And since that time, the use of those substances in churches has only increased. And the more churches were built, the more children disappeared without a trace. Only the true followers of Christ, who were able to preserve his teaching in purity, did not use such methods. And Cathars didn't have them for 1200 years either, until they were decimated. Do you know who else were among those few who never used adrenochrome and never sacrificed children? Satanists, I mean those in the original sense of this word. The Church of Satan has been created just recently, while in essence, the religion of Satanism consists in recognizing the supreme God through recognition of the highest form of opposition to everything holy. It means a recognition of the special mission of Satan, which is to restrain and not to let unworthy ones come to God. Satanists themselves also strove to reach God, but their path went through exploration of evil and comprehension of all the filth and worthlessness of this world. Understanding that there is the devil, they realized that there is God, and relying on this understanding, they subsequently came to attempts of gaining God's love. This is also a path to God, and in this kind of Satanism, there were no sacrifices or use of those substances which were used in other religions. It is believed that Christianity became the all-conquering light that defeated the cruel doings of idolaters. And with the advent of Christianity, children's ritual sacrifices stopped. Did they stop, or did the priests learn to hide their traces better? It looks like people forget where the history of Christianity as religion began, when the followers and propagandists of the already altered Paul's teaching were openly called the greatest criminals for the sacrament of killing and eating children. Have you forgot about it? Or haven't you known it? Those were not just rumors or gossip. Those were straightforward accusations, and those scums had to defend themselves. It was said that for their rituals, Paul's Christians took a very young child who was unaware of what death is and would laugh at the sight of a knife. They murdered him, and then soaked bread in the blood of the tortured and killed child, and ate it jointly with all their brethren. Priests tried to justify themselves by saying that unreasonable people literally perceived the meaning of the sacrament of communion understanding the symbolic use of Christ's flesh and blood directly, while some priests even maliciously gloated, saying, "Well, no one has caught us with human baby meat in our mouths yet." But in fact, those who accused them were just trying to save their children. Later on, under the general slogan, "Let's fight heretics," Christian priests suddenly started accusing others of what they themselves had been initially accused of, and conversations about their own dark deeds began to gradually subside, as if this never happened. But you actually know the devil never hides anything. He always leaves everything in plain sight. It's just that his power over your minds is so strong that he covers your eyes for you not to see even what is obvious. Holy icons clearly depict communion bowls with babies inside them, but you are being told that this is Jesus Christ and the symbol of his sacrifice. No, it's not even a symbol anymore. It's a straightforward text for those who know, and an outright mockery of you all. You worship those icons and hang them at home on the walls, not even being aware of what you worship. And when, during the communion, a priest suddenly had real human blood, or flesh in the cup, or in the bread, they explained to you that the Lord himself thus worked a miracle to strengthen people's faith in the Holy Communion, and that bread and wine really turn into the flesh and blood of Christ. The most famous event of this kind is the miracle of Lanciano, although similar things repeated many times after it. The Church justifies these miracles by the fact that the type of blood found in the communion bread and wine matches the type of blood found on the Shroud of Turin. What else can they refer to other than their own fake? It's just that the artist goofed up a little bit and went too far with the flight of fancy, because Jesus didn't have a beard. These alleged miracles are particularly cynical, since even after the laboratories confirmed that the fragments of flesh turned out to be tissues of a heart, which had been in agony. No one questioned the priest in their church how those tissues actually got into the communion meal. Moreover, those fragments of a child's agonizing heart were exposed in a crystal vessel for believers to worship them as a sacred item. Can you imagine what millions of believers bow to? In your opinion, is the blood and flesh of a tortured baby a miracle or evidence of a crime? How do you think events would unfold if human blood and fragments of a heart were found not in the hands of a priest, but in someone else's? Would that be defined as a miracle? Or perhaps it would cause other associations in people and would have completely different consequences. The latest alleged miracle of this kind, officially recognized by the Catholic Church, occurred already in the 21st century. This is just for your information. Didn't you yourselves taste blood on your lips when a priest handed you a spoon with the communion meal? But you were told that it's the flesh and blood of Christ, and that you must believe in that. So you did believe. You believed, drank the blood of slaughtered children, and experienced such ecstasy that you were really convinced of joining the body of Christ. Fools! It was imputed to you that it was the blood of Christ, just so that the taste of blood would exalt you instead of scaring you. And you keep reveling in it to this day. Yet when entering your temples, have you not felt waves of overwhelming fear? Have you not felt a grave cold inside them? Have you not felt all the evil and darkness that permeate everything in your temples? You did feel and know everything, but you came to your temples anyway, not realizing that at that moment you were actually stepping over your conscience, over glimpses of your soul that was trying to reach out to you. However, you stepped over your soul as well. So who are you after that? Are you sure you'll get into heaven after all this? This is the greatest mystery that the priests of all religions have been concealing from you. And not all priests actually know it. Many only know that in order for incense or communion to work, they need to buy the same flour, the same labdanum, and the same wine in strictly defined places. There, in old prayerful places, where the great priests of the past prayed. Then those products work. When ordinary priests make communion bread of that flour, use that particular wine and the special labdanum, they see how their flock gets inspired and begins to worship them. And they themselves feel how during the service, their church is illuminated by the presence of the Lord Himself. After all, priests are the same humans as everyone else, and they themselves often fall under the influence of adrenochrome, but they cannot explain this phenomenon. However, they also see that when they buy the same products at a lower price from other suppliers, the overall effect is exactly the opposite. Church services are boring. Their voices no longer have that power. The Lord doesn't come, and people fuss and complain about the stink. The flock comes with problems and leaves with the same burden. Even fanatical believers are restless and say that Satan overcomes them. As a rule, people leave dissatisfied with the service. So if the priest doesn't buy another batch of authentic products, he notices how his church is gradually becoming empty. For instance, today, the best labdanum for Christian churches is produced on Mount Athos. It is made in secluded monasteries, according to secret recipes, and no one has yet managed to surpass its producers. So nowadays, Athos is a very closed and quite peculiar peninsula, where a lot of children are secretly brought, yet none of them return. But who knows about that? Nobody. And to this day, the production of labdanum isn't controlled in any way there, and no one inspects it. It is the greatest mystery, but it's an extremely large-scale and serious business involving numerous national leaders, law enforcement agencies, and almost the entire management of various religions. All this is a multi-billion-dollar business, and there is enough money for everyone, because it's the most expensive and profitable commodity that has ever existed and still exists. It's not that expensive to buy children who are stolen, and there are certain groups doing that around the world. No matter what countries we would take, if there are priestly cults there, children definitely disappear there too. But it's not that expensive. It is not so expensive to torture children to death and to make a potion. It's not that expensive to buy this potion. But all this is quite generously paid for by the parishioners. Believers bring their last possessions just to come into contact with that bliss over again, and to get rid of those sins which they have again managed to commit. This is extremely expensive for the parishioners themselves, but they have no doubt that God fulfills their desires. They have no doubt that they come into contact with divine power, thanks to the prayers of their priests. That's why, with great heartfelt generosity, they build new temples and generously dispense alms. The more powerful a religion is, and the more influence it has in a country, the more the authorities are interested in it. Remember one thing: any authority is interested in the existence of religion as a tool of suppression and control of your will. Therefore, authorities have always covered and supported it. It is beneficial to both the rulers and the priests, while ordinary people get what they want: an illusion. an illusion of salvation, and an illusion of contact with God. They are happy with that. And everyone is happy. Everyone is happy except your children, who are used in the production of adrenochrome, which you yourselves later generously pay for. The price of your sense of absolution is too high. If you think that the use of adrenochrome was not introduced in Islam, you are mistaken. Yes, the elements of communion were not included there, but the practice of using special incense was introduced quite effectively, and the first one to introduce this tradition into Islam was Umar ibn al-Khattab. I already told you a lot about his contribution to the distortion of Islam, so it's no surprise that he made a contribution to the adrenochrome business too. Umar explained the Prophet's sunnah to Muslims in his own way, abolished traditions which the Prophet himself had established, and introduced other traditions. He drove people into buildings, lined them up like a herd in front of one imam, and introduced a tradition of fumigating mosques with incense, which in fact contained essential oils extracted from fragments of the brains of tortured and murdered children. Certainly, as long as the Prophet Muhammad was here, it was impossible to introduce anything like that into Islam. He would cut anyone's head for such an activity. Remember, the Prophet Muhammad's biography describes a plot when he destroyed the altar where Goddess Alat had been worshipped. Do you know why he did that? Because priests had gone vile to such an extent that even in Alat temples, they had been using those substances made of fragments of the bodies of slaughtered children. And he destroyed that altar because he knew what was happening on it. Later on, this part of the story was altered, and there only remained a record that the Prophet had destroyed the alleged idol of polytheists. But this is not true. In fact, he, on the contrary, defended the memory of the goddess Alat. And if you look from this perspective, everything falls into place. Prophet Muhammad knew perfectly well that such a practice existed. Therefore, he held conversations with his followers outside. He deliberately did it. But as soon as he had left this world, Umar's gang immediately composed new hadiths, which the Prophet had nothing to do with. Everyone knew and saw with their own eyes how the Prophet fought against incense and body oils because adrenochrome was spreading through them. However, what he had been fighting against was introduced as what he had allegedly commanded to do. In one of the hadiths, Umar's people wrote that the Prophet allegedly had a vessel from which he anointed himself with incense, while in reality it was Umar who had such a vessel. And those incense were the substances that enslaved the minds of people, because they supposedly gave them an opportunity to come into contact with Allah. The path to Allah which the Prophet spoke about wasn't simple, and people had to work hard on themselves in order to experience at least something. They faced the resistance of their nafs, unsteadiness, and many other things. Whereas with Umar, it was enough just to be near him, inhaling the smell of aromatic oils that he abundantly anointed himself with, or go to a mosque, inhale the smell of incense, and get a state of bliss and a sense of the presence of Allah himself. It was much easier than working hard on the path, earning the love of Allah. Of course, that easiness attracted people very much. Therefore, Umar never parted with his pot of magic potion that gave him authority. And for this very reason, Umar was raised almost on a par with the Prophet Muhammad, and even higher, because he allegedly gave people what the Prophet didn't give, an opportunity to get closer to Allah himself and to feel him. Thus people betrayed their Prophet. And not only because of money and authority, but also because of the magic potion which Umar possessed. Now Muslims, adherents of the most perfect religion, as you enjoy calling Islam, those of you who have been to Mecca, recall, what does the Hajj smell like? Imagine, once a year, a huge number of pilgrims come to Mecca to circumambulate the Kaaba for a nominal fee. Do you think the priests would miss the chance to take advantage of such an event? Of course not. What states do pilgrims experience during the Hajj? Lightness and bliss, the same as you experience in your temples. And where does this elated state after the Hajj originate from? From the fact that a person walked in the crowd, almost got trampled and became inspired since he survived? No. He gets a powerful hormonal reaction, and these states are triggered by essential oils, which are sprayed in huge amounts throughout the territory around the Kaaba. Just for you to understand, dozens of kilos of incense are being burnt, and everything around, including the cloth on the Kaaba, is sprinkled with dozens of liters of various perfumes containing Umar's magic potions. Moreover, fumigation of the space and dispersion of aroma substances is carried out regularly, several times a day. And this is done throughout all the days of the Hajj. Here's the truth about the most perfect religion, and no one but me will share it with you. This is also the answer to the question, why a great deal of stupidity entered religions, which often directly contradicted the words of the prophets. And people did not object to that, because it didn't prevent them from receiving grace regularly in their temples. Even the image of God was shaped for people in a way that doesn't fit into any common sense. But it was an image reinforced by strong narcotic substances. Therefore, people still continue to go there, worship and believe. If a person has experienced such a touch of God's love in a temple, he really believes that it is its touch. Will he believe that at that time he was inhaling essential oils extracted from a child who had been murdered in the most cruel way? Or will he believe that during the Holy Communion he drank the blood of a child mixed with wine? No, he is sure that it is indeed God's grace in this very temple, with this particular priest. There are temples attended by a huge number of people, temples that are considered to be prayerful, and the priests in those temples are considered powerful and nearly holy. No matter what they do, their flock forgives them everything and turns a blind eye to many things. This is really authority. Do you think they will give it up? Never. Even pedophile priests are acquitted, when even parents of the victims of those pedophiles do not believe their own children, but they believe the priests because they are so good they couldn't do such a thing. Why does this happen? When a mother knows what this unholy father is doing and personally brings her child back to his temple, how to explain such actions of people? They have simply been treated with adrenochrome a long time ago, with the one made from the blood of other children who disappeared on the streets of maybe even a completely different country. It's a huge business. These are millions of missing children a year. According to the published data, 8 million children disappear in the world annually. And as you know, official statistics always downplay such indicators. In other words, the number is actually higher. Where do they all disappear to? For organ harvesting? Come on. Nowadays, transplantation, moreover pediatric transplantation, is not so developed for children to be stolen for organs in such enormous numbers. All in all, about 150,000 transplant surgeries are legally performed in the world every year. This is a total number for adults and children combined. Let's suppose the same number of surgeries are done illegally. However, this is only a couple of percent of all the missing children. So what organ harvesting can we talk about? Over this entire time, hasn't anyone had enough wits to do the math? These are your children. How many children disappear and get into sexual slavery and forced labor? Check the UN statistics. Their numbers do not match. Several million children disappear without a trace. Where are they? Where are the children? Okay, the older ones could be used as slaves or in sexual perversions. But where were the infants and children under 6 years old taken? Were they sent for adoption to kind people through the black market of human trafficking? Not so long ago, sales prices for children surfaced on the darknet, and the most expensive turned out to be exactly children, under 6 years old. After the age of 6, prices sharply drop. Why is that so if older children are more suitable for both sexual and labor slavery? Just because those little children never get into any slavery, they get back to you, to your temples, into wine, into bread, and into air. And you yourselves, believers of all religions of the world, eat millions of your own children. After all, it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to see how many children disappear in your countries and compare their number with the number of temples. Just don't forget to multiply this number by the number of big religious holidays, and you will get an approximate picture of reality. Now, some smart guys are allegedly exposing a fake, claiming that the number of missing children is overstated. Allegedly, statistics do not take into account the cases when children safely returned home, and that in fact, the percentage of those who disappeared without a trace is not that big. Yet, I have a suggestion for such clever people. Show me those children. Prove that they returned home. Dozens of thousands of children disappear in every country, while only a few of them return home. And there are many more children whom no one even counts. Those are kids from children's homes who were sold to specific countries, orphans from orphanages affiliated with temples and monasteries, children who were born on child-raising farms operating in Africa, as well as children of refugees who flee from the sites of war and climate disasters. In fact, what is now happening with the climate shows very clearly that day by day, there will be even more of such events. The world is literally on the verge of self-destruction. But even at this time, those bastards will keep holding onto their power to the last moment. There is a vivid example of how Hawaii was burning. Everyone heard about it on the news. Do you know what news surfaced among others? When the fire calmed down and people began to cope with its consequences, it suddenly turned out that a huge number of children had disappeared from the island. Where are those children? Yes, some of them died, unfortunately. But many were taken to the production of adrenochrome. This is an objective situation of today. Be sure that when your houses will be engulfed in fire, when everything that you've built will be collapsing, and the ground will be slipping from under your feet, at that time someone will take away your children to prepare products from their tortured bodies, which will later be given to you as food so as to preserve the authority of those scums over you. Haven't you heard about these facts? Didn't you know that children disappeared? You knew. Didn't you know that these children died a horrible death after being abused in every possible way? You knew and kept silent because it wasn't your children who died. But even when your children died, you went to temples and kissed the hands of those who had skinned them. And you believed that even if your child died, he would be in heaven. However, he turned out to be not in heaven, but in your stomach. There have been lots of such cases, and there will be many more of them until Allah cleanses the earth from you. In fact, everything has always been in plain sight. Why do you think the ninth circle of Satan order was established? This was done by the priests to divert suspicion from themselves and to set up the rulers of this world, the powerful and famous people. Adrenochrome was thrown to them like a bone to a dog, simply like a drug, so that they could rave, realizing that there is no God for them. Those who are in the ninth circle are well aware that they have one life, and they enjoy it to the utmost, because until someone dies in torment, they won't get bliss, and until someone goes broke and becomes a barefoot beggar, they won't get money. These are simple mindsets from the priests for the powerful people of this world, and for those who instill images into your heads, which you later copy. The same puppets who instill images tell you what to wear, what to drink, how to dress, and what to drive. And this is promoted in Hollywood movies, on big stages, on television, and through your phones. You elevate those stars to idols while they are merely puppets of the keepers, who will do whatever they are ordered to. You look at them, and you begin to be drawn to everything secret. They show signs to you from the stage, and you pick this up like brainless sheep, in order to somehow get closer to the elite. While in fact, all these games are merely a distraction from the real problem. However, if it suddenly happens that some information about the ritual murders of children pops up, those stars will be the first to be sacrificed. Those who rule the world would rather give up the entire Hollywood than any single church. It is actually very easy to replace those celebrities. If you suddenly get mad and ask where your children are, you'll be told that wretched bunch of people have eaten millions of your children. And do you believe in that? There are only a few of them, and they take only hundreds of children, while you devour millions. You devour them in order to lose your mind and your own will, to become slaves, not of God, but of a priest, and to vote for whom it is necessary, thereby supporting those appointed by the keepers. Yes, you see madness happening in the world, but what have you done to stop this madness? And what will you be able to do? You are slaves, and all your indignation ends in the kitchen or after the first communion. Then you don't care about anything. The main thing for you is to be loved by God and to have your sins forgiven. While in reality, you, like drug addicts, live from dose to dose. Brainless and weak-willed creatures who consider themselves humans. Everything is in front of your eyes, but you don't want to see it. Otherwise, it will disturb your comfort. There will be no more comfort for you if you don't build it yourselves, and life will no longer be yours if you don't get it back. You keep feeding the Apexians, just as you fed them 25,000 years ago. Back then, you served their appointed priests, and so you continue serving them, and consider yourselves intelligent people worthy of salvation. Isn't this ridiculous to you? Murders of children have always been practiced in all religions, and they will continue to the end of your days. Even knowing what I told you, you, like zombified sheep, will go and open your mouths to swallow another portion of children's blood in order to experience what you experienced. Even being aware of it all, you will go and do that because you are zombified sheep. But you might ask me, wait, where are the bodies? If this is happening on such a scale, if so many children disappear, something is actually supposed to remain of them. Why hasn't any evidence been found yet? That's where there is another nuance. In the past, on that very Mount Athos, children's remains were simply dumped into the sea, and many kids were buried right at the sites where they were killed. Entire cemeteries of the tortured and murdered children have been found next to your temples and monasteries across the world. Public statements were made about this many times, but you didn't attach any importance to that. You preferred to believe what you were told, that there were epidemics, and children died of diseases. But in such a case, why are certain fragments of skulls and pelvic bones missing in their remains if they died from epidemics? Why do traces of severe injuries remain on numerous bodies of those children? The injuries they received when they were alive, slowly and painfully dying. Do you think it's a kind of decease? But thousands and thousands of children buried alive are still lying under the altars of the most successful temples of your religions. You can argue that such remains that are found are usually centuries old, but where are the modern ones? Everything is really simple. They were completely disposed of. Not because the priests had become smarter, but because they've become greedier. It is stupid to waste tons of meat that costs money. Here's the answer for you. There are sausage shops at monasteries or those owned by churches, meat processing plants, animal and fish fodder production sites, as well as pigsties from where you later buy meat. Yes, those are the very pigs who shared the eating of your children with you. After all, you enjoy buying halal and kosher sausages in stores. But where do they originate from? And what were they made of? Just count for yourselves. If 8 million children disappear every year, that's 80 million in 10 years. Think about it. It's a whole country, quite a big one. And where does it disappear to? This is a huge industry with a multi-billion-dollar turnover and billions of people who are controlled through adrenochrome. Billions. If you think that you don't go to churches and don't take communion, which means you don't eat children, don't hurry to rejoice. It is hardly possible to find a single person in your so-called civilized world who has never tasted human flesh. For the sake of power, those scums have never disdained anything. A human is a greedy, rotten, vile creature who won't miss any opportunity to earn profit. As for those whom you consider nearly saints, even my master disowns them. Even the devil is horrified by their doings. I'll paraphrase the well-known expression. Definitely, the road to hell will be paved with robes of priests, and never, under no circumstances, will they voluntarily abandon this business. You have to understand that a huge number of people experience those blissful states in temples. Religions have existed for so many millennia, precisely because people themselves support them. Although in history, there is plenty of evidence of what priests did and keep doing. Imagine what would happen if a person who made a Hajj or a pilgrimage to a holy monastery suddenly found out that he sniffed and ate dozens of tortured and murdered children there. How would he react if he knew that in order for him to experience the so-called spiritual states and to receive forgiveness of his sins, children experienced a painful, agonizing death? What would such a person do? And imagine, what is a mother ready to do if she suddenly finds out what happened to her missing child? What will she do if she finds out that when she came to a temple to pray for the imminent return of her missing child, when she took communion and experienced the precious moments of comfort, at that time she was eating her own child? Therefore, authorities have always been concealing it all and will keep concealing it, because if masses of people learn about it, this will cause uncontrollable chaos. No army in the world will cope with a furious crowd, just because the military themselves will be in that crowd. You can fool people with anything. You can mock them and put them in unbearable conditions. A human can tolerate anything and adapt to everything, but everyone will stand up for the children. And then people will take pitchforks and go after those who did this to their children. Even ordinary priests who haven't been initiated into this sacrament will go along with the crowd, otherwise they will also be lynched. In this case, any king and any president will have to support the people, otherwise they will sweep him away. That's the reason why this secret has been so carefully guarded by the keepers. If at least in one place such a fact is proved that adrenochrome is used in temples, no one will hold the wave of rage. Therefore, no president will ever come out and openly tell about this, even if direct evidence is found. It is advantageous for the authorities when a huge crowd of raging people is submissive and does what the priests tell them, and when the authorities themselves control the priests. As a matter of fact, children's blood have been found in communion meals, and remains of human bodies have been found at church meat processing plants so many times. And what did it all end with? With nothing. Only those individuals who found it and didn't want to hush it up were in trouble. If it became more or less known, those people who made accusations later either suddenly rejected them themselves, or were accused of extremism or anti-Semitism, or were simply exterminated. And all of this was quickly forgotten. There were numerous cases like that. However, people aren't fools either. They can actually draw a simple parallel that the more people there are on the planet, the more temples are being built, and the more children disappear. It is all directly proportional and interrelated. And if at least one president came out and said such a thing, it would become a precedent for the rest of the world. Can you imagine what this would lead to? All people would rise up against those who fed them with the remains of their own children. That's why many are afraid of publicity, even those who disagree with what is happening. They know what the consequences will be, but they cannot oppose this crime in any way either. In their time, the first communists tried to fight this opium for the people because they knew firsthand what priests were doing. They were well aware of what they were dealing with and what kind of power the priests actually had. At first, they fought this crime quite successfully, but then Comrade Trotsky interfered. The great defender of orthodoxy, Trotsky. I wonder why the priests haven't made him a saint yet. He really did a great service to the church. At the time when Dzerzhinsky rigorously opposed the church and insisted on letting the fading religion ultimately die, Trotsky did everything for the church not to die, and even to become more powerful. He supported and promoted the implementation of an idea that the church didn't need to be destroyed and simply had to be reformed. then it would act as a tremendous force that would support the communist idea. Trotsky was basically at the origin of close cooperation between the government and the church, in the form preserved to this day. At the same time, quite a little was required of the church to recognize that the Soviet government was established by God, and that the party policy fully corresponded to genuine Christianity. Everything is as usual. Thus, prayers for the rulers of the country were again included into church services, along with sermons on how to love the authorities and consecration of monuments of various figures, even of such a communist as Stalin, for instance. At Trotsky's suggestion, the church was removed from under the supervision of Dzerzhinsky's Cheka agents and became subordinate to a newly formed commission headed by Trotsky himself. Even when Trotsky was moved away from church affairs, what had been before him never came back. And such machinations occurred despite all the power the communists had at that time. After the war, knowing from the past experience of how the church could easily defect to the enemy just to bring back as many parishes as possible, the communists decided to take it under stricter control. At that time, KGB agents began to penetrate the ranks of the highest church leadership. This way, they hoped to end the use in churches of adrenochrome extracted from the bodies of tortured and murdered children. However, KGB agents were actually ordinary people who came to churches and saw what opportunities opened up for them there. In such a case, what would prevail? Communism, lofty ideas, and shoulder straps, or cassocks, people's veneration, and huge authority. Certainly Simone eventually won. In addition, they themselves were exposed to adrenochrome and knew what it was. Therefore, KGB officers themselves became the ones who used their brains to bring this business back on a large scale. So don't be deluded. It will take place as long as there is power and money. This business gives too much authority and too much money for anyone to refuse it. They will never give it up. Even in fear of exposure, they will continue to slaughter your children. And in order to reinforce their authority over you, they will do anything. It is easier for them to buy everything, to bribe and to kill everyone than to give up. For you to understand what kind of authority they have, I'll give you an example. In the 1950s and 60s in the Soviet Union, the topic of ritual child sacrifices resurfaced again in relation to Protestant movements that entered Soviet republics in large numbers. At that time, it even reached the level of propaganda, when this topic was openly discussed in mass media and certainly severely condemned. Thus, there were at least attempts to inform people. As a result, some movements were banned at the legislative level, since they were accused of ritual murders and communion ceremonies with the blood of murdered children. Back then, it was said that the communists revived the old myth of the blood libel within the framework of their policy of militant atheism. However, as I already said, the truth is that the same technology is used in all religions. Subsequently, in the 1970s, when Yuri Andropov became the KGB chairman, he noticed that a large number of children disappear in the USSR every year. It would seem that there was a totalitarian regime, borders were closed, and documents were needed to leave the country. Nobody could just take children abroad as easily as it is done nowadays. Back then, it was out of the question. Everything was checked everywhere, and everything was accurate and under strict control. Nonetheless, children vanished without a trace in huge numbers. This definitely couldn't be the work of some all-national maniac. Victims were too numerous, and where were the corpses? At that time, in the Soviet Union, the search for children was the top priority. The government was really concerned about that, and children were indeed looked for. Andropov also paid close attention to this problem. He discovered that a pattern similar to that in the Soviet Union was observed in other countries of the socialist camp. According to the data he received from abroad, children were missing there as well. Thus, he realized that this was a massive phenomenon taking place all over the world. The question was, why? Since a little bit earlier, in the 1960s, there was information about the ritual murders of children, Andropov decided to check this version too. In such a way, he found the answer to his question. He learned about the use of adrenochrome in churches. Being a father and a sensible person, he was astonished. He decided to end this evil once and for all. After collecting relevant evidence, in 1976, at a closed meeting of the USSR Communist Party Central Committee, Andropov reported to the top party leadership about the situation, which he had managed to uncover. And the paradoxical thing was, although it is neither new nor surprising, that no one wanted to listen to him. He was advised not to get involved in this matter, to occupy himself with something else and just forget about it. After this event, Andropov realized that he would not be able to do anything at the official level, since members of the Central Committee were against even discussing this topic. Religion played its own special role in the country. Andropov was aware of that and understood the threat posed by the priests, as well as the authority they possessed. He was also perfectly aware that their authority rested on slaughtered children, on adrenochrome. He foresaw that they would eventually ruin the Soviet Union. But all he could do was to fight through unofficial methods to the best of his power and ability. For this purpose, in 1978, under his full personal leadership, Andropov created a secret service intended to resist the use of adrenochrome in churches. It was a specially trained unit, similar to Alpha or Wimpel, for example, which included honest people, loyal to the USSR. They worked undercover, collected materials, and directly opposed ritual child murders in the territory of all the Soviet republics. However, given the scale of what was happening, it was like shooting sparrows with a cannon. Even after becoming Secretary General, Andropov couldn't openly speak out and resist the entire network of production of those substances, which entangled the whole of the Soviet Union. There was nothing he could do against the keepers and their people. Having enormous power and huge nuclear potential, Andropov decided to make an open statement, to lance this ulcer, and to end it with one strike, at least in the territory of the Soviet Union. But he didn't have time. Instead, for everyone, he simply died a natural death, because the keepers always keep track of such processes, control everything, and are well versed in the methods of the old Hassan. As soon as Gorbachev came to power, one of his first orders was to destroy all the collected evidence and to completely purge all people who knew about child murders and were involved in fighting them. The order was executed without delay by secret services themselves. Thus, Andropov's special battalion, the elite of special forces, the best of the best officers, whose upbringing and training had taken a huge amount of time, were simply erased. Along with them, the unofficial group of researchers and analysts who were involved in investigation, collection of evidence, and so on, was also liquidated. Serious efforts were made to eliminate these people, and based on the coherent actions of the executors, they definitely worked according to a pre-planned scenario. This means that when Gorbachev was just coming to power, he already knew what he would do. But how come? And who was interested in that? So, almost everyone who knew about the murders of children for extraction of adrenochrome and its use in churches were decimated. That's more than 1,000 people. If you're not lazy, you can find evidence of those events yourselves and see how many people from the secret services simply disappeared from this world. These losses of personnel, who in fact were involved in Andropov's special operation and who were in the know, were very roughly written off as losses in military hot zones and on secret missions, while in reality, Secret Service officers were engaged in their elimination. That is, they killed their own colleagues. Those people who worked in the KGB at that time and witnessed those events knew and spoke about them. Later, former KGB officers wrote about Gorbachev's actions in their memoirs and notes. Information about the existence of Andropov's secret special unit and its destruction leaked to the Western press as well. Many people shared their arguments and thoughts about what had happened back then, but no one knew the exact answer. Yet, you know it now. I have told you this for you to understand the seriousness of what is happening and all the authority those scums possess, which you yourselves give them by blindly obeying and funding them. So live with this knowledge from now on as you want. Various people tried to fight this abomination in temples at different times, since remote antiquity and, as you can see, in modern history too. But no matter how powerful a king or a sultan was, all of them ended up the same way Andropov did. There are numerous examples of this kind. However, there is actually a difference. In the days of sultans and kings, there were no laboratories and no video cameras, whereas during Andropov's operation, huge archives were collected that really threatened this whole bloodthirsty organization. Those are the results of tests of samples, as well as lots of photographs and videos depicting all criminal actions, including the abduction of children, where they were transported, how they were tortured and slaughtered. The entire process from its beginning to its end was filmed and documented. These are irrefutable proofs. Therefore, those archives were surely hunted for, and there were many attempts to destroy them. But there is such a popular expression in classic literature that manuscripts do not burn. As far as I know, some of the archives have been preserved to this day. No matter how hard priests tried, they couldn't destroy everything. And as far as I know, their latest attempt to destroy these traces was made not so long ago. However, if they managed to destroy the one whom they regard as their main enemy, those archives would surface simultaneously in different places with a full package of proofs. This is my personal opinion, and I would do so. If this information reached people, it would seriously undermine the entire priestly organization, and the consequences would be irreversible. Rumors are one thing, but documents and results of expert examinations are something completely different. Yes, there is a problem with these substances. They do not leave any traces in a human body. If you take a person's blood for tests after he visits a temple, all you can reveal would be traces of a powerful hormonal surge. But all this can be easily explained by the state a person has experienced. Of course, hormone levels would be very high. After all, he allegedly came into contact with the divine, and in some cases, even saw divine manifestations with his own eyes. But other than that, there wouldn't be anything extraneous in his blood. Similarly, there would be no traces of any genetic material or anything like that in one's stomach. I mean, you wouldn't find any residual effects from the influence of those substances in a person himself, because those are not chemical compounds, but organic ones. Therefore, a human body quite easily absorbs them, without leaving almost any traces. But it is actually possible to take air samples in a temple for examination, as well as to check wine and bread for the presence of human red blood cells and bone particles. And if you additionally do a DNA test, you can even determine how old the child was and maybe even find his parents. It is obvious that if you start checking temples, priests will begin to hide it all. But that's not bad either. At least adrenochrome can disappear as a manipulative tool from their arsenal for a long period of time, which means significant weakening of their organization, because, without adrenochrome, they have nothing to impress their flock with. You cannot retain a crowd for a long time on fairy tales only. People will start leaving temples. This, in turn, will expose weakness of the priests and clearly demonstrate that the only thing that kept people in temples was adrenochrome. If a temple stops using adrenochrome for a year, it will become empty. Or maybe just a few months will be enough, and then only fools or the most desperate old ladies will remain there. So, if regular inspection of temples for the use of bionarcotic substances in rituals is introduced at least for a year, in a year we will see a decline of religions. The funniest thing is that even after everything I've told you, many of you will continue to live as you lived. But there will also be those who will argue, doubt, and try to refute my words. After all, who am I to be listened to? Just a black spot on your screens. You can doubt. You can disbelieve me. But try to prove that I'm wrong. Everything is very easy to verify. Take samples from the air and from the communion meal to examination. Do you think you won't find fragments of bodies of recently disappeared children there? If you have doubts, go ahead and check. And then you will understand that I'm telling the truth and the verity. From now on, you must know that anyone who will oppose this truth, anyone who will begin to resist and contradict it, is either corrupted by the keepers or intimidated by them, or he is the one who does this evil himself. What I'm now saying is an exposure of the greatest fall of humankind before Allah. It's a black mark for each and every one. It will either purify you or not. It is the greatest secret that each of you has been keeping. You saw and knew everything, but decided to remain silent. However, the one who knows about a crime and is silent will be responsible in the same way as the one who committed it. Each of you will be fully responsible. And it doesn't matter whether you attended temples and ate children there, or you only heard about that, but kept silent. Even if you did not enter temples, by succumbing to the effect of adrenochrome in others, you became one of the flock of sheep and obeying the herd instinct. You bleated along with everyone else what the keepers needed. In fact, it's enough for only a few sheep to go in a certain direction, and the entire flock rushes after them. Don't you recognize yourselves in this? Or does pridefulness hinder you? It's too late to exalt your pridefulness. Everyone's time here is running out. With your silence, with your submissiveness and servility, you've gone against the main foundation of the universe, against life itself. You have let millions of children lose an opportunity to live their lives and bring their fruits to Allah. You have deprived them of their free choice. You have violated even simple human rules. You have gone against your own conscience. And for this, humanity deserves a black mark, and that which is coming. You can disclaim this black mark only by admitting the truth, only by reaching out to each other and becoming one united civilization. That's the only way you can gain the right to live. You were artificially divided. False values were imposed on you, and you were turned into slaves. So only if you admit that you are slaves, you can become free. Only then will all of us have a chance to stay alive. For millennia, the entire humanity was enslaved by the Apexians. It took people 1,000 years to find the strength to unite and turn to the highest race so that they would liberate them from slavery. At that time, people did find the strength. But will they find it now? Yes. Many of you lack intelligence and will. You are easily manipulated. But in each of you, there is also the power which even such highly developed creatures as the Apexians are hunting for. If you join this power and manage to channel it in the right direction, you can achieve a whole lot. But will you have enough wits and elementary humanness for that? Good question. Today I'm fulfilling the will of Allah by voicing the truth and exposing the lies and manipulation started by the beasts. But what has been the reason for my revelation? Some time ago, I publicly addressed the great architect of this world. I asked him to change his mind, and at least not to hinder, because all of us are now facing a threat. However, he pretended not to hear me, because for them to lose authority means to lose the meaning of their existence. That is why today I'm exposing the greatest secret and the mightiest tool by which their authority is maintained on this earth. They have no other power except the one you give them by eating your own children. Now, knowing this secret, you can easily get rid of their authority over you if you have enough courage, humanness, and elementary human conscience. Then you will be able to become free, and then your children will stop disappearing. You will finally sober up, and your minds will be cleared of all manipulations. Maybe then you will finally regain sanity, and will be able to see all the sadness of what is happening, and all the danger of climate change. Then perhaps you will manage to make the right decision and to come together. Or, on the contrary, you will continue living your lives just as before and support falsehood in order to experience incredible divine ecstasy, at least occasionally. In such a case, it will be your choice. You will destroy this world with your own hands. This is your common problem and your own choice, and neither God nor anyone else has anything to do with it. You knew and saw everything, but you were satisfied with it all. Hence, you are satisfied with what is coming. Although, if you have a conscience and an aspiration to live, you will be able to change many things. Not only will you be able to attain freedom from the keepers, but also to preserve life on this planet, which means my life too, and even the keepers' lives. The only thing that you'll never be able to fix and bring back is the lives of millions of slaughtered children. They will always remain on your conscience. Those who did this to them are made of flesh and blood. They can be identified, caught by the hand, and brought to justice. All their authority and power rested on secrecy, but now there is no secret anymore, and people are able to put an end, even to this crime, lasting for nearly 30,000 years. However, there are also those who take away your lives and the lives of your children in a way you cannot see. This world is full of those who hide in the shadows. They do not influence the fate of nations, but they affect people's fates. These are the so-called spiders. You cannot catch them by the hand, and it's not that easy to see them. But the number of children they killed would also make up many cemeteries. Well, maybe we'll talk about them some other time. I've said it all for today. Now, the choice is yours.